Maya civilization is one of the most incredible phenomena that occurred in the New World.
What led to the collapse of the great Mayan civilization of Central America?
The advantage of archaeology for exploring the past is that we can see the whole picture.
Using high-tech satellite and Lidar images, Dr. Keith Proofer and his students peer through the dense jungle canopy to discover ancient Mayan ruins. What he found is fascinating.
A sort of light bulb went off in my head, and I thought, we know in the Chaco area they had scarlet macaws, which are birds that come from the Mesoamerican tropics. Chocolate comes from that same area.
Chaco chocolate? Forensic technology helps to tell an unexpected story about the Anasazi in Chaco Canyon. Dr. Patricia Crown has found evidence of chocolate inside 1,000-year-old cylindrical jars from Pueblo Bonito.
Our research has shown that the populations living in Chaco had chocolate beverages.
Dr. Crown's findings are the first concrete evidence that the people of Chaco traded for cacao beans.
Stony asteroid coming into the atmosphere, it gets to higher and higher pressure and it starts to deform. When it breaks up, its kinetic energy is converted to heat and it completely vaporizes and it explodes.
And in our viewer question, Dr. Mark Boslow uses the Red Sky supercomputer at Sandia National Labs to discover what might happen if an asteroid explodes close to Earth. Each month, we connect with great people and inspired thinking found at the University of New Mexico. Connect is next. We are actually, yeah, so we'll kind of get into it in a minute. Joining us now is Dr. Keith Proofer with the University of New Mexico. He's an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology. So tell us what you've been up to in Belize.
For the last 8 years, I've been running a large environmental archaeology project in the southern corner of Belize, which is a very remote and rural area. It's been inaccessible for many, many decades, and only recently did roads even arrive in that area. But it's also home to, a large number of small Maya villages, agrarian people who live in very tightly knit communities and are farming the same lands that their ancestors did. And it's those ancestors that we're particularly interested in. Maya civilization is one of the most incredible phenomena that occurred in the New World at any point in time. They certainly weren't the largest cities. We know that larger cities in central Mexico, Teotihuacan, at the same time as the Maya, and then later on the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, were much larger urban centers, but the Maya are kind of different in that it's a series of city-states spread out across an enormous area that were both interacting with each other, at conflict with each other, and probably shared language, shared religious ideas, shared forms of political symbolism, but at the same time were autonomous. Their beginnings go back probably 2,500 years ago or more, but it was really about 300 to 400 BC that they began to coalesce into what we recognize as being the classic period Maya. And they were persistent. They persisted for almost 1,000 years, which is a very, very long time. If you think about the context of the country we live in and how long that it's been a state unto itself, it's less than 3 centuries, and we're talking about an incredible amount of resilience that went into the ability to maintain large political systems for almost 10 centuries. And my project is really interested in understanding what are the processes that allowed small farming communities to coalesce into large urban kind of city-states, and then to be successful, and then ultimately to reach very high population levels before kind of abruptly falling apart.
How did you select that particular area?
Well, this is a very interesting region because we know it has abundant rainfall. We know that, that it's on the periphery, and we also know that the cities are a little bit smaller. They're a lot more manageable. The name Ushbenka was given to it by archaeologists who initially discovered it in the late 1970s. And when they went in, they asked people what the name of this place was, and they said Uchbenka, which in Maya means the ancient place. Trying to develop a large picture of how an urban center grew and changed over time is a very lengthy, very expensive, high level of investment. If you could try imagining going to New York City and excavating it and trying to figure out what happened, a lot of problems would occur. So having a smaller site kind of on the edge can give us an indication of what processes are at work in development and decline, but also in a sense it's more manageable in terms of collecting data and processing it.
We're talking about the 9th, the 10th century. You've made some pretty interesting discoveries.
Yeah, we've been really successful at kind of defining when things occurred. We rely really heavily on kind of scientific techniques to try and understand these processes. So we do a lot of radiocarbon dating. We do a lot of trying to organize stratigraphically, or layers through time, how things kind of came together and grew before falling apart. And we're able to do so through kind of a combination of intensive laboratory work with a lot of intense field work, a lot of excavations. I have large crews of graduate students in the field working with members of the Maya communities who assist us in our excavations to try and move a lot of dirt to try and get at the past.
The contemporary Maya people, how does that picture look today?
Well, you know, a lot of people, when they talk about the Maya, they think that something happened in the 9th century and the Maya disappeared. And what mysteriously, the mysterious collapse of the Maya. And this has been a subject of archaeological discussion and debate for a long time. The reality is that there's still 4 to 5 million Maya people living across an area of Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras. And these people are divided into more than 30 language groups, and in many cases, they have been integrated into modern society. In other cases, like where we work, they still maintain relatively rural farming communities where they use very low levels of technology to produce food for themselves to eat. So we know that the Maya civilization collapsed, the political institutions unraveled and fell apart, but the populations themselves persisted and still live across Central America.
Some of those mores and norms that they used centuries ago are still evident in some of the contemporary.
Absolutely. I mean, certainly linguistically, they've preserved their language. The community that we work in, which is a Mopan Maya speaking community, 100% of the families speak Maya. All the children are raised in households that speak Maya. They farm in much the same way that their ancestors did. The technologies and the techniques and the knowledge of the landscape, the knowledge of soils, of water, of climate patterns, of rainfall, are things that have been handed down through generations, and they're very, very successful farmers. You can think of, you know, a community of people that is small, 400 or 500 people, and average income is only a couple $100s a year per family. But nobody's hungry. Everybody has everything they need for food.
You think we're any closer to answering that question? What did happen to the Maya?
We were a lot closer to answering that question than we were 20 or 30 years ago. One of the most persistent questions about the collapse or the decline of Maya civilization has been whether or not it was caused by a large drought, whether drought drove the collapse itself. And there's always been a couple of camps, one that says that drought was a major factor, and others that say that, you know, this was a civilization that became very unstable. There's a lot of lessons we can draw for ourselves from this. Think of a large civilization of people with elites or rulers, economic elites and political elites who are extracting more and more from the population, populations that are growing and putting pressure on their own landscapes, their agricultural landscapes. And you create a system that becomes very fragile and is subject to pulses, sometimes negative pulses, depressions or recessions that it can occur as things become more unstable and people become more unhappy. We now really look at it as probably being some combination of instability from within the society itself, endemic warfare between competing political systems, and this was probably given a little nudge by what is obviously climate change that occurred at the time. We know that the climate played a role in terms of that there was a downturn in precipitation starting in around the 7th century, and it seems to have driven an already fragile system kind of over the top.
The technology you're using, the Lidar, is that, does that sort of support the theory that climate change was indeed a big factor?
The Lidar actually just gives us more of a snapshot of what the environment probably looked like then and looks like now. Lidar is a technology that employs radars essentially flying in an airplane to take images of the ground and allow us to peel away the vegetation so we can see the bare earth. Previously, in order to find parts of the ruin, whether it was central parts or smaller households in the countryside, we would have to hack through the jungle with machetes, find these buildings, and then map them in. Lidar peels away the vegetation from the surface for us and allows us to have a glimpse of everything. It's been really, really helpful for understanding the degree to which people in the past modified their landscapes. So we know that as these cities evolved, as these cities grew, elites built large buildings, temples, palaces, other types of structures that kind of showed their power and authority within the community. And to do that, they altered their landscape tremendously. They moved hundreds, of thousands, if not millions of cubic yards of soil. They transported huge numbers of rocks for buildings. And the LiDAR really allows us to get a glimpse of how that worked, how that landscape was altered, how much it's changed in the past, and to be able to identify the extent and size of the site itself.
And how do you use that data to identify this?
Essentially, we look for patterns. We have images that show the landscape itself with all the vegetation on it. When we remove it, we can see the individual structures themselves. We can see the arrangements of households in the landscape. And we can then go in and excavate these households and begin to determine, you know, did this start as a village in one small place, then expand outwards? Were elites centered in one place? Were they more dispersed across the landscape? Were they?
You can really do that with the LiDAR?
We can use the LiDAR as
see
the
structures? Wow.
Yeah, we can see them individually.
That's
and
amazing.
it's really an amazing technology that's just been introduced to archaeology in the last few years and is now taken off like wildfire.
What actual discoveries have you made?
Through excavations, we found that this particular small site that we work at, Ushben-Ka, persisted probably for 900 years as a community. We know that it began as a small farming hamlet or village, probably a handful of people, maybe a dozen or so families living on the landscape, and we know that they probably were affiliated with more distant populations as well. And we know that they were successful probably for 400 or 500 years just as a small village before at some point in time around the 2nd century AD, they began to consolidate into a larger community. And this means that certain individuals would have had to take control. We see the emergence of leaders, people who were probably both charismatic and coercive in their ability to mobilize labor. And it's at that point in time we start to see alterations to the landscape. We begin to see public architecture being built. We begin to see elites being buried in large tombs, which is a sign of their status and power. And we also begin to see a period of success as populations began to expand, more households appeared in the landscape. And Ushben-Ka clearly became a regional center at that point and probably an important trading partner for other nearby communities.
And you've been sharing that with the Maya.
We're one of a handful of projects that actually work within a Maya community. So the ancient remains of Ushben-Ka, the ancient city itself, which probably at one time housed between 10 and 15,000 people, is now located right in the smack in the middle of a small Maya farming community. So we employ people from the community to help us in the excavations. We share with them, but we also develop educational programs we put forth in the schools. My collaborators and I have built curriculum around environmental and cultural heritage that allows us to bring some of our discoveries not only to adults but also to children within these communities, because obviously moving forward, these children will be the ones making decisions both about their own communities and about their landscape, but also likely the future of the ruins themselves. And
what about the future? What do you think the future holds for this kind of research?
I think this type of collaborative research that involves both scientists from geology, climatology, archaeology, but also ethnography and applied anthropology in terms of education is really the future of where the field is going to have to go. I think we have to both collaborate with the communities that we work in, but also make our data, our findings understandable to people whose past we're exploring. People do want to know what we find, and they are curious.
Wow. That is pretty interesting. It's neat too that you might actually be encouraging some of the descendants of that population that you're doing the research on to kind of keep it going.
We hope that, you know, in the future that people will utilize these cultural resources that they have in their midst, both to strengthen their own communities, but also to help with their own economic development. Of course, you know, for Americans and for people from all over the world, they're drawn to Central America to visit these ruins, and they become kind of sources of income for small communities in terms of development that can occur around ecotourism. And there's a new type of, you know, ecotourism that's up and coming, which has to do as much with cultural sensitivity to the modern landscape itself as well as to the past, because of course the present is just a continuation of this long history that's occurred in this region.
How do we learn as we go into the future from the past? So how did you personally get into this? What drew you to this kind of research?
Well, I've always been fascinated by complex systems and complex societies, and I've been an archaeologist for many, many years. What really drives my interest in this kind of work is the parallels that we can draw between how ancient civilizations interacted with their landscapes, how they developed how they were resilient to changes that occurred within their own populations and with the ecosystems they lived. And what this means for modern society is we face today many of the same problems. Food scarcity, how do we produce enough food to feed growing populations? How do we deal with many people living together in small areas? How do we deal with political and economic systems that can be very exploitive? And how do we do so in the context of changing environments and changing climate?
Wow, so you really think that for something from the 9th or 10th century, the way that they dealt with it could actually have an impact on the way we do that today?
Sure, I think there's a lot of lessons we can draw from the past. The advantage of archaeology for exploring the past is that we can see the whole picture. We can see how Ushbenka started as a very small community, how it consolidated into a larger political entity, how populations grew, how leaders became more exploitive, and ultimately how things fell apart for them, how the state that they had disintegrated. Not the population persisted, but the political system fell apart. We can see the big picture, and I think that this can give us examples and lessons we can use to face our own problems today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prover. That was really interesting.
Great, thank you.
Now is Dr. Patricia Crown. She is a distinguished professor of anthropology at the University of New Mexico. Is it a surprise to us that the Chacoans had chocolate?
It was a lovely research surprise to discover this, but in other ways we already knew that they had access to other items from Mesoamerica, and so it fits. It makes a lot of sense that they would have gotten chocolate as well. Chaco Canyon is located in northwestern New Mexico and was occupied from at least 10,000 years ago, really to the present day. The time period that we're talking about is from about the late 800s up into the 1100s, and particularly the time between 950 and 1150 AD. During that time period, our research has shown that the populations living in Chaco, who are called ancestral pueblos, had chocolate beverages that they drank. Initially, I was interested in looking at cylinder jars, which are a kind of ceramic vessel. They're about 10 inches tall and about 4 inches wide on average. Different archaeologists had speculated that they might have been ceramic hand drums, that you could put a skin over the top and maybe some water inside to change the pitch and beat on the drum, or they might have been used to store valuable objects. And so there was a question about how they were being used, and I was interested in trying to solve that.
Still no mind or thought toward chocolate at this point.
Not at all. And then one day I talked to a Mayan archaeologist who also researched cylinder jars in the Maya area. And she said that down there they were used for drinking chocolate. And I asked if she had done residue analysis, expecting her to say yes, that's how they found out. And she said no, actually they found out because it says it on them. The Maya had writing, and so right on the vessels it said, this is
For drinking chocolate.
This is for drinking chocolate, exactly. And a sort of light bulb went off in my head, and I thought, we know in the Chaco area they had scarlet macaws, which are birds that come from the Mesoamerican tropics. Chocolate comes from that same area. If they can bring a live bird up, surely they could bring some chocolate up. It's about 1,200 miles from Chaco to the nearest tree that grew cacao. The chocolate comes from the Theobroma cacao tree, and so it is a very long distance.
Yeah. You know, when you think of ancient cultures, or way back in history, and we're talking that Mesoamerican period, I guess my thought is, I'm not thinking about somebody enjoying a drink of chocolate, but why not?
At this point, we don't actually know exactly how much they had or how often they had it. We do know that the cylinder jars were at least at times used for drinking chocolate. And in Chaco, it may be that only certain individuals had access to the chocolate, that it wasn't everybody who could eat it, which is a shame.
Yeah, well, what is the evidence?
Primary evidence is what's called organic residues. We find them by taking broken pieces of pottery, we call them sherds in archaeology, and taking fragments that are about the size of a quarter. We actually burr off the exterior, grind up the interior. So these aren't visible residues, these are invisible residues that have soaked into the wall of the pottery. So we grind up that interior, and then we analyze it by a technique called high-performance liquid chromatography mass spectrometry. In the case of cacao or chocolate, what we're looking for is primarily one of three organic compounds, theobromine, theophylline, and caffeine, which are all in chocolate.
So the cylinders that were discovered in Chaco that are now in the museums, those were not exactly tested.
So I wanted to be sure that we actually had pre-Hispanic chocolate in the vessels, so we used fragments of sherds that we could grind up. The cylinder jars that we call Chaco in cylinder jars, there are only about 200 of those known anywhere in the world. And most of those come from Pueblo Bonito. I think 166 out of all of them come from Pueblo Bonito. And then within Pueblo Bonito, 111 come from one room called Room 28 within the site. And they were excavated in the 1890s by a graduate student from Harvard named George Pepper and Richard Wetherill.
What about the historical impact 100 years after the cylinder jars were discovered?
Generally, I think it demonstrates that archaeological collections in museums continue to have value long after they've been excavated. It's just so much more that we can learn from these old collections. We know that there was some kind of interaction between people in Mesoamerica and people in the Chaco world. What we don't know is how exactly the chocolate got up into Chaco. It could be that people from Mesoamerica brought it northward into Chaco. It could be that people from Chaco walked south and got chocolate in the south, or it could be that it was passed village to village on its way up to Chaco Canyon. And these are still all open possibilities that we need to explore more.
So we know they drank it, but did they drink it for medicinal purposes? Did they drink it for pleasure?
Chocolate has a lot of nutritional value. It's very high in fat, as we all know, and it has quite a number of vitamins and minerals as well. The Chacoan diet would have been primarily corn, beans, and squash with occasional meat, and so having chocolate added to that diet would certainly be a benefit. In Mesoamerica, it was consumed primarily in association with ceremonies and important life events. Warriors would drink it before going into battle to give themselves strength. And the whole issue of how they were using it really is something that I'm trying to work on now.
Sure. And do we have any indication that there were actual recipes?
Really, up until the 1800s, chocolate was not eaten as a solid food, it was a drink. And so we're talking about really chocolate drinks that were a combination of cacao and water and then some number of additives. We are trying to work out what additives were in the chocolate in Chaco. We know in Mesoamerica that they added substances such as ground corn, chili was often added to it, annatto. And for people in Mesoamerica, the Maya, the Aztec, the froth was considered to be the most delicious part of the entire drink. So we think that frothing really was an important part of preparing the drink. Chocolate isn't the only thing that's appearing in these vessels, and we're trying to tease out exactly what is happening with that. It looks like in different parts of the Southwest they may have had access to different kinds of beverages that had stimulants like caffeine and theobromine in them.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Patty. Really interesting stuff.
Thank you.
One of the things we want to do is compare our simulations to events that actually happen. If the asteroid is big, it will punch right through the atmosphere, hit the ground, and form a crater. And a good example of that is Meteor Crater in Arizona. And it was formed by an iron asteroid that wasn't that big, maybe 50 meters across, 150 feet or so. But it was coming in really fast, literally faster than a speeding bullet. But a smaller asteroid doesn't make it to the ground. I've run these models on supercomputers, and what it shows is a stony asteroid coming into the atmosphere. It gets to higher and higher pressure and it starts to deform, and then it breaks up. When it breaks up, its kinetic energy is converted to heat, internal energy, and it completely vaporizes and it explodes. What I'm showing behind me is a simulation of the Tunguska explosion. That was an explosion over Siberia in 1908, and it penetrated deeply enough into the atmosphere that the explosion affected the ground. And what it did was it created strong hurricane-force winds that blew over trees over an area of something like 700 square miles. I think the Tunguska explosion was from an asteroid 30 or 40 meters in diameter. If we found one of those, we probably wouldn't find it with enough warning to actually deflect it. So the most likely scenario is we would find it days to weeks in advance. We would be able to very accurately predict where it was going to hit, and we could evacuate the area, very much like we evacuate people from the path of a hurricane.
Do you have a question for our experts? Please email us your viewer questions and comments to askconnect@newmexicopbs.org. Thank you for watching. Production support provided by the University of New Mexico.